Hey guys, ready for the last of the adaptive bots on chess.com, and next up we have Natasha Bot from Belarus, who's rated around 2000. But the idea with the adaptive bots is that if you start to do well, they will up their game. If you start to do less well, they will kind of ease off a bit. So human players do have that tendency as well. But let's go through this game. I was actually contacted by chess.com buddy today, Yorkie Chess, who said, I finally beat Natasha, finally beat the Natasha bot. And I thought, she's the last one on my list, so let's have a go at her. So I'll take you through the game. So I get the white pieces, I played random, and we have e4, e5, and I play the Vienna. We have knight to f6. Vienna Gambit is declined, and this is the best move for black in the Vienna Gambit, to play d5 straight away there. And the book continuation goes f takes e5, and then knight takes, and then you bring out your other knight to f6. Okay, so far so good. So we've traded a pawn each. She now plays her bishop out to e7, preparing to castle. And I play my queen to e2, and the point of this is it's adding a second attacker on the knight here. Natasha now goes ahead and castles, so I grab the knight and a free pawn. Why not? And now g6 is played. So this is one of those moves where, it seems like nothing much, but you have to be very, very careful with moves like this, particularly when your opponent still has their coloured bishop of the same colour of the squares that you are weakening with this push. So the pawn that's in front of the king is dark squared, so now this is making my dark squared bishop maybe a bit stronger. So I push d4, adding a second defender to this, grabbing some central space. She pushes c6, I bring out my bishop. Now I'm getting ready to castle, and she brings her bishop out, pinning the queen here, and also looking at the pawn behind. So I just drop the queen back to e2, where she came from, and defending the pawn. Okay, now we have b5, and I just drop my bishop back here again. And now the knight comes out to the edge of the board. And I just push now c3. So it means that my bishop still has scope to get round here. My dark squared bishop also still has scope. So there's always ideas about dropping it here and forcing the rook to one side. But also playing this move just removes this square from the knight, if that was Natasha's intent. So the knight now moves back. Maybe that was the idea all along. I castle, putting my rook on the semi-open f-file, and she pushes a5. I now push my pawn, just to remove this square from the bishop, and she pushes, I retreat the bishop, and we trade off light square bishops. Okay, so far so good. So it means that now we've both got dark square bishops still left on the board, but the board is dominated by this dark squared pawn chain. Now Natasha slides the rook across to e8, and I drop my bishop over there anyway. I mean, if nothing else, it's removing two squares from the king, so the king now only has these two squares that he can move to. Now the knight comes in, and I centralise my rook onto e1. We have a pawn push, and I push b4, just kind of blocking up this side of the board. Okay, so I want the action to be around that king over there. Fairly comfortable situation. We have a face-off of bishops. I decide to retreat, put my bishop here, attack the queen. It's defended by the knight. So the queen now moves across to c7. And now I decide to break in the middle with c4. We have takes and takes. Now my queen is lined up with the king. And we're, everything's pretty balanced, although I'm still a pawn up. Okay. Now we have two attackers against this pawn here. The knight and the rook are both looking at that. So I just drop my bishop back to d2. No reason to give up a pawn so cheaply at this point in the game. But then I realise actually there's three attackers. Okay, so we trade off bishops now. And I just drop my queen back here looking at this pawn. So now Natasha's actually equalised. I was a pawn up from the opening, no longer a pawn up anymore. So let's just review the pawn structure. I've got a nice central 2 and a solo guy over there. She's got a 3 and 2 singletons. Okay, I'm still quite happy that this pawn is moved. Might give options later on. Okay, so queen now comes down, so we've got 2 attackers on this pawn, 2 defenders so far. I slide across, grab the undefended pawn. Now rook comes in and I just lift my rook, defended by the king, and we trade off a couple of rooks and we trade off queens. So at this point I'm thinking, okay, I've got 2 pawns here and 1 there, right? So I might be okay here to be able to just try and remove this pawn, and maybe shepherd the d pawn might be a good one to promote, or the a pawn if he gets lucky up that file. So I slide my rook over to a1 to defend the a pawn. Knight comes in. We now have 2 attackers on this pawn here, which is tricky, but I can defend. So the knight comes down as a second defender as well as the king. We really don't want to give away cheap material. King advances, now I strike out with the a pawn. We have a check, just go there, check again, go there. This is actually a fork on king and pawn. Okay, so I move out the way, he grabs the pawn, she grabs the pawn. Okay, a5, knight starts to cover, but there's actually no time now for Natasha to secure this or make this square safe, this promotion square. So knight comes in, I get a queen and we trade off. So now I'm a knight in front. With a master's game this would be a formality, but I still got a lot of work to do. So I stick my rook behind her runaway c-pawn. Rook has a look at my knight and the pawn, but I can defend both with knight to f3. Comes back to look after the pawn. So now all my pawns are actually protected. King's got those 2, that pawn's protecting the knight, knight's protecting that. This pawn's actually pinned and can't move forward, so e6. Rook comes back, I grab the pawn. King can't recapture, king goes to there, I grab that pawn. Okay, and king grabs that pawn, and now we're in a situation where, let's say we trade off rooks. This could be, there's a risk of a drawn endgame. King advances, I give check, attack the rook, come back, attack the rook again. Okay, so I'm attacking the rook, rook has to move, and there could be a trade-off of rooks. And so now we're down to 2 pawns each, but I have a knight. Can I make it stick? Can I make it count? Knight comes back looking at the pawn, knight comes back again. And now we're in the situation where it's all about the relative positions of the kings. Okay. So you don't want to end up in a situation where you'll get a draw by repetition because the kings just move backwards and forwards because they can't, neither of them can risk moving away from the pawns. So I push h4, king moves to here, go back, push another pawn, now give check. Okay, so now my knight is covering some key squares, my pawns are covering these squares as well, so we're starting to remove some options from black's king. King comes into f5 and I grab the opposition. So now the king cannot advance to any of these squares. The pawns can't move, so the king has to move. Okay. Now I move my pawn. I was expecting takes and takes, but then my king would be guarding that, my knight would be guarding that, and I also still have a free pawn move, but I can't move the pawn because if pawn takes pawn, we're left with a king and a knight against the king, and you can't win with a king and a knight. So fortunately here, Natasha moves the king away, so I grab this pawn here, because now if pawn takes, I can easily keep this king out while Harry the h-pawn proceeds to promotion. So we have takes, move the king up, king moves backwards again, couldn't move to any of these squares anyway. So now I simply move my knight out of the way, go and grab the pawn, and now the h-pawn just shoots up. Okay, and we have a queen, and it's a standard queen and king ending. And in fact, in the end, I decide to use the knight. So I give check there, king to a2, queen there, king to a1, queen b1 is checkmate. And that is how you beat the Natasha Bot. I mean, I have to say, that felt more like playing a 1500 player than a 2000 for me. It was a fairly comfortable game. I didn't feel at any point like I'd been completely undone by the Silicon Demon. But yeah, satisfying win. Natasha can be beaten, everyone. You have to take your time. You have to watch your back, obviously, but that's the same with all the bots. They can, it's so tricky. Sometimes it seems like they only think for a couple of seconds and then they can pull out something really, really deep. But that's what happens when you're playing against the engine. So fortunately with the adaptive bots, I think that's not too bad. I don't know if I could repeat the same kind of performance against a non-adaptive 2000 bot, but we shall have to see when I pluck up the courage and get round to it. But thanks for watching, thanks for your support, I'll see you soon.